Everything seemed to be going so well for Hitler. By the summer of 1941, he looked like he would be one of those rare individuals in history who would get all he wanted. He had absorbed the Rhineland in 1936, Austria in 1938, and most of Czechoslovakia without a fight. When fighting finally came in 1939, he defeated Poland in weeks. After a period of relative inactivity called the Phony War, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France all fell in weeks in the spring of 1940. By the summer of 1941, German forces occupied the Balkans too. Almost all of Europe from Spain to the Soviet border was under Hitler's control. So how did he throw it all away and end up committing suicide in a Berlin bunker? Let's take a look at some of the most critical mistakes that ensured Hitler would lose World War II. The first reason for Hitler losing the war was because of his intransigent, inflexible political ideology. All wars are first and foremost political beasts. The continuation of politics by other means, as Clausewitz famously said. However, this principle was truer for Hitler than it was for other wartime leaders. Hitler saw World War II not only as the rightful rectification of Germany's loss in the First World War, but as a way for Germans to complete their supposed racial mission, the destruction of Jews and communism, the latter of which was ultimately an expression of Jewish politics. In his second book, the unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly referred to communism as Jewish Bolshevism and to the Soviet Union as Jewish Bolshevist Russia. In this light, it should be unsurprising to know that the Soviet Union had been Hitler's real target all along. He was willing to put up with the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 for a while, to ensure he would defeat his enemies in the West and not fight a war on two fronts, as occurred in the First World War. But the destruction and conquest of the Soviet Union was Hitler's ultimate geopolitical objective. To Hitler, the Soviet Union was not only the center of the supposed Jewish Bolshevism, but also a vast, valuable landmass, ideal for the settlement of German colonists, who would expand rapidly in number following the destruction of the Jews and communism. This was the Lebensraum, or living space policy, the idea that ethnic Germans should replace the native Slavic population in the lands of Eastern Europe and Russia. With the increased number of Germans, they would need an increased amount of land, and Hitler intended to conquer it for them. The Lebensraum idea originated in 1901, with the writings of the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel. Ratzel argued that every nation needed to be self-sufficient in resources and territory to protect itself from foreign threats. Darwin's theory of natural selection influenced Ratzel and those who followed him. They believed that all nations struggled for resources among one another, where only the fittest would survive and get to expand their numbers. For ethnic Germans, the lands in Eastern Europe were a necessity for them to continue to expand in number. The Lebensraum idea gained traction in World War I, when Germany temporarily conquered most of Eastern Europe and established a military state called Oberost. The native people who came under the rule of Oberost were there to benefit Germany with their resources and lands. Non-Germans were subjected to the imposition of German culture called the Culture Mission. With the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, Germany had conquered vast territories, far beyond the boundaries of the original Oberost. However, Germany's defeat later that year ended its plans for turning Eastern Europe into German living space. Hitler never forgot this, and became convinced that Germans needed the lands and resources of the East. Therefore, instead of stopping when he was at the height of his power, Hitler believed he needed to invade the Soviet Union. Therefore, for deeply rooted historical and ideological reasons, he thought that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union could not survive together. One of them would need to fall. The decision was Hitler's biggest mistake of the war, but not the only one. The way Hitler conducted the invasion of the Soviet Union was also a mistake. He wound up achieving surprise when the guns opened up on completely unsuspecting Soviet forces on June 22, 1941. However, that date would prove to be another mistake. The invasion of Soviet Russia actually came too late in the year. He originally wanted to start in May, but decided to intervene in the Balkans when his Italian ally Benito Mussolini suffered embarrassing losses. This operation was successful, but delayed the start of Barbarossa to late June, and that lost month, as we shall see, would prove critical. The invasion of the Soviet Union was successful in the immediate term. The German forces demonstrated their skill in Barbarossa just as they had in every other operation of the war to that point. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured in huge pockets. For a while, it looked like Hitler's idea of a grander blitzkrieg on the vast Soviet battlefields would be just as effective as the concept had been in Western Europe. However, this was where Hitler made what was arguably his biggest operational mistake. Instead of continuing the drive on Moscow, which had been making such rapid progress, Hitler decided to split that force, called Army Group Center, and reinforce Army Groups North and South, which were driving on to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and Ukraine respectively. On August 21st, he ordered that the conquest of Crimea and other economically valuable parts of Ukraine should take priority over the drive to Moscow. Hitler's generals vigorously protested this decision, but to no avail. The Germans continued to win, but these were tactical and operational victories at the expense of strategic success. When Hitler resumed the drive on Moscow in early October, he had done so after losing a month that he badly needed. By early December, the Germans got within 12 miles of Moscow, and a reconnaissance unit actually got within 5 miles of the city, but that was the limit of the German advance. The Soviet counteroffensive that began on December 5th ultimately pushed the overstretched and undersupplied Germans 150 miles away from the capital and industrial heart of the country. By failing to take Moscow when he had the chance, Hitler ensured he never would, and that the Soviet Union would stay in the war. Hitler fired many of his generals who advised a tactical withdrawal at this time. Others who were fearful of being fired or worse simply no longer had the courage to object to Hitler when he made a decision, no matter how foolish or unworkable it was. The result was that Hitler further put himself at the heart of German military command, making himself responsible for more and more military decisions. This was another mistake that would cost him the war, and it began to show itself as early as the next year. The German army suffered its first major reverse at the end of 1941, but it was far from a spent force as 1942 began. With war against the United States declared that December, it became much more important for Hitler to win the war against the Soviet Union or face the thing that had destroyed Germany the first time around, a war on two fronts. However, in capture the city of Stalingrad in order to secure the advance on the Caucasus. Given the city's name, both Hitler and Stalin assigned it even greater political importance. Perhaps as an easy psychological answer for the problems this new operation presented him with, Hitler believed the Soviet forces were exhausted, a belief that would prove another costly mistake. The German Sixth Army succeeded in capturing most of Stalingrad by November, but then the Soviets launched their Operation Uranus counterattack and attempted to encircle the city. When General Friedrich Paulus requested Hitler's permission to withdraw from the city to save his army, the latter refused, saying that the German army needed to stand and fight for every inch of ground. The result was the encirclement of the 300,000 German troops that were in the city. A relief attempt led by General Erich von Manstein proved unsuccessful. He only had a small fighting force of about 50,000 men to undertake this task, and it quickly proved impossible to supply the Sixth Army by air, as Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring had originally proposed. Meanwhile, because Hitler's permission had not been granted, Paulus refused to try to break out from the city and join von Manstein, and the result was the surrender of all his forces to the Soviets in February 1943. Stalingrad proved the tipping point of World War II. The German army had lost some of its best troops and officers, which could not be replaced. It was no longer capable of conducting strategic offensives on the Eastern Front, a result confirmed later in the year during the Battle of Kursk, when an attempted German offensive, Operation Citadel, came to failure. By invading the Soviet Union because of his political ideology, Hitler put the vast fabric of power he had built for himself at risk. By failing to defeat the Soviet Union when he had the chance, he guaranteed that he would slowly but surely fall from this pinnacle. However, Hitler's mistakes in World War II extended far further west. By the middle of 1943, the United States and Britain had kicked Nazi Germany out of North Africa and begun the invasion of Europe, starting in Sicily and moving up through Italy. This shift in the balance of power forced Hitler to divert resources to the west, ending his hopes that the war could be won before it came to a two-front affair. However, by late 1943, it became apparent that the Allies would be planning to breach the Atlantic Wall, a string of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, and invade the heart of Nazi-dominated Europe. In a document entitled Führer Directive 51, Hitler explained his reasoning for believing that the Anglo-American attack in the West would pose an even greater danger to Germany than the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front. In the East, the vastness of the space will, as a last resort, permit a loss of territory even on a major scale, without suffering a mortal blow to Germany's chance for survival. Not so in the West. If the enemy here succeeds in penetrating our defenses on a wide front, consequences of staggering proportions will follow within a short time. All signs point to an offensive against the Western Front of Europe no later than spring, and perhaps earlier. For that reason, I can no longer justify the further weakening of the West in favor of other theaters of war. I have therefore decided to strengthen the defenses in the West, particularly at places from which we shall launch our long-range war against England, for those are the very points at which the enemy must and will attack. There, unless all indications are misleading, will be fought the decisive invasion battle. By this time, Hitler had become convinced of his own supposed military genius, even as the war was deteriorating. Despite these failures, he still had military control increasingly concentrated within himself. For example, the organizational structure of the German army in the West proved helpful to the Allied task of deception. For example, not all of the German armored forces on the Western Front reported to the commanding officer in the theater, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Instead, some of them were organized into Panzer Group West, which reported to General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg. Von Schweppenberg nominally served under von Rundstedt, but he was also directly responsible to Hitler. Therefore, any deployment of the panzer divisions, which the Allies rightly feared, would need to come from Hitler's direct authorization. The Allies knew that if they could deceive Hitler about the place of the real invasion, more than half the job would be done. The confusing command structure of the German forces on the Western Front confirmed that. Long before the invasion on D-Day, Hitler proved indecisive about deploying the panzer divisions which had accumulated into his hands. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been tasked with strengthening the Atlantic Wall's defenses, advised that the panzer divisions be made available to destroy the Allied forces on the beaches whenever they came. However, von Rundstedt disagreed. When Rommel went above von Rundstedt and appealed to Hitler, the Nazi dictator was indecisive and tried to accommodate both of his officers. Rommel got 3 of the panzer divisions. Meanwhile, 4 more remained with Panzer Group West, and 3 more were transferred to Army Group G, a force south of the Loire River, and also under Rundstedt's command. Thus, by the time D-Day rolled around, most of Germany's best assets for repelling the invasion were horribly dispersed. Some were south of the Loire, a completely irrelevant theater for defending the Atlantic Wall. However, this would not be the only mistake Hitler made during the Normandy campaign. The Allied deception would be based on the points which Hitler was describing in his directive. There were only a few places where a landing could be feasible. The Allied plan was to convince Hitler that point would come at Calais, the closest landing across the English Channel. To add to the impression the Allies would be invading at Calais, they created a fake unit, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. This fictitious entity was to be commanded by General George S. Patton, who had a reputation of being one of the best field commanders in the Allied forces. The most famous aspect of this deception was the inflatable tanks, trucks, guns, and other instruments of war that the Nazis would detect in their surveillance. But this was just the beginning. Fake radio communications were meticulously sent out, fake documents were prepared, fake patches and other insignia were allowed to be seen. Troop movements were coordinated to appear as if Calais would be the direction of the advance. To further help matters, nearly all of the Nazi spies in Britain had been intercepted and turned into double agents by this time, through the Double Cross program. The most unique and important of these double agents was a Spanish citizen named Juan Puyol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Unlike the others, Garcia had intended on spying against Nazi Germany from the start. When he reached out to the Nazis after being turned down by the British, he voluntarily revealed himself and became a double agent for the latter's intelligence network. Garcia concocted an imaginary network of 27 sub-agents, each of which had extremely specific background information. Through meticulous attention to that and other details, Garcia and his imaginary network flooded the Nazi high command with information that it considered reliable, but in reality was unusable, even when it was true. This modus operandi stretched all the way back to 1942, when enough true details about the landings in Operation Torch were leaked to the Nazis for them to consider Garcia a reliable agent. Succeeding in the initial D-Day landings on June 6th was only one objective the Allies would need to accomplish to fully breach the Atlantic Wall, and liberate Western Europe from Nazi domination. Once the beaches were secured, they would need to sell the idea to Hitler that the Normandy landings were just a diversion, and that the real invasion would still come through Calais. They could not afford for the Nazis to mobilize all their forces, especially their panzer divisions, and concentrate them in Normandy. If they did, the invasion would be thrown back into the sea. On June 5th, Garcia sent a warning for his supposed Nazi handlers to stand by for an urgent message that would come in the small hours of June 6th. He was supposed to be reporting that he had detailed intelligence that the drive toward Calais would begin, but the radio operator he was assigned to communicate with was absent on the job. This act of carelessness permitted Garcia to inform the Nazis about some more true details about the actions at Normandy than the Allies had originally intended, but as usual, too late for them to take action. Garcia added further to his credibility with an insult: "I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon the work." Then on June 9th, Garcia informed the German High Command that the real landings would still come at Calais, showing bogus documents that supposedly revealed elaborate organization for an invasion plan involving the Patton-commanded Fusag. For Hitler, who believed that Calais would be the likeliest point for an invasion all along, these messages were especially convincing because they seemed to confirm his belief in his own military genius. Von Rundstedt also fell hook, line, and sinker for the deception. The result was that few of the panzers were used against the Allies in the critical phase of Operation Overlord. On July 29th, almost 2 months after D-Day, Hitler awarded Garcia the Iron Cross for his extraordinary services to Germany. Even in August, many of the German forces, including 2 armor divisions and 19 infantry divisions, were stationed in Calais, watching for an invasion that would never come. By that time, it was far too late for the Nazis to throw the Allies back into the English Channel. With his unfounded self-confidence as a military leader and the incoherent command structure he created as an expression of it, Hitler ruined his chance to stop the Allies from breaching the Atlantic Wall and opening a war on 2 fronts. As fate had it, Hitler was right about one thing. His warning in Directive 51 the year earlier became a reality. His last roll of the dice in the Battle of the Bulge failed that December and January. In less than a year after D-Day, Hitler shot himself in the head, in confinement in his Berlin bunker, with the forces of the Soviet Union he had been so confident about invading closing in rapidly on his position. Dictators have a tendency to be megalomaniacs. It is perhaps this personality trait that causes them to seek power in the first place. However, once in power, the tendency toward megalomania will be naturally reinforced. Combine the already unstable personality of someone like Hitler with a grandiose millenarian ideology and the absolute power of a dictator, and you get the ingredients for self-destructive decisions, made in the absence of informed criticism. More competent people are afraid to speak up for fear of being overruled, or worse. Adolf Hitler was far from the only dictator, before or since, to exhibit this set of behaviors, but he is the most infamous, not only because of the war and genocide that he started, but because of the stupendous errors he made in conducting it. On many occasions, Hitler could have prevented defeat if he had made different decisions, but he seemed to make the wrong one each time. But what do you think? What other errors did Hitler commit that caused him to lose the war? Be sure to let us know in the comments.